Oh, one more, two more. This is good. Tēnā koutou kua hui hui mai nei, e mihi ana ki ngā mana whenua, ko Craig Cliff toku ingoa, e mahi ana o hei kai whakahaere hōtaka hua waru kore aho, ki te whare wānanga o tākou, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to this OERC seminar today on school energy efficiency opportunities. I'm Craig Cliff, I'm the Net Carbon Zero Program Manager at the University of Otago. And we're really lucky to be joined today by two speakers to talk about school energy efficiency. First up, we'll hear a little bit from ELLIOT Jones, who's from the Ministry of Education. And then we'll hear from Jeff SMIT, who's a director at DETA, one of the two firms that were engaged to carry out energy efficiency trials across New Zealand. And importantly for us, located in Te Waipounamu, DETA had the whole of the South Island and the lower North Island, so all the important schools. And then ELLIOT will come back and talk a little bit about where to next for the ministry and for schools, and taking the lessons from this work and applying it, and hopefully talk a little bit about applying a carbon lens to schools infrastructure as well. If not, we can ask them to do that in the questions. And yeah, so if you've got questions as they go through, feel free to pop them into the chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. And as an added bonus, I was ELLIOT's boss back in 2020 when this work was commissioned at the Ministry of Education. So I can act as a phone a friend if their memories start to fail them. So with that, I will hand over to ELLIOT. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko ELLIOT Jones aho. I am a senior policy analyst at Te Tahua Te Mātauranga, the Ministry of Education. And yes, Craig used to be my boss, which is partly why I'm here today, but partly it's just going to be interesting to really kind of talk about this piece of work that we did with DETA support, and kind of this whole space. A lot is happening. So I'm happy to take questions, and if Craig doesn't ask hard questions because he used to be my boss, that would probably be great. So I will just share my screen, and Craig gets to tell me if we're actually seeing a presentation.
Yep, we are.
Yeah, cool. So the kind of plan is I'm just going to set the scene a little bit about where energy efficiency kind of sits within infrastructure and what infrastructure means to the Ministry of Education, and then kind of what we've been doing, why we did the energy efficiency trials, and then Jeff from DETA is going to talk about how they actually did it, what they learned from it, and then I'll come back and talk about what we took from that and kind of what we've done with it next. And as Craig points out, kind of now that carbon is this big important space, not that it wasn't before, but it's kind of got prominence now, how we have shifted and kind of connected into that as well. So at the Ministry of Education, we oversee and support the property management of more than 2,100 schools with more than 16,000 buildings. This was something that seems obvious when you think about it, but when I joined the ministry, really shocked me because I hadn't really thought about it. So there is a lot of work that goes into looking after that. And one of the things that we have been set by the government to do is that all schools have quality learning environments by 2030. And so as part of that, our school property strategy 2030, Te Rautaki Rawakura, the vision is all schools having quality learning environments as part of a well-managed and sustainable portfolio that helps deliver equitable and excellent outcomes for every child. So that's great, but how do you achieve it? So one of the programs of work that we are currently developing, and Craig worked on when he was at the ministry, but now we are moving into a space where we'll be implementing it from 1 July 2023 is Te Harato, which is our quality model around the physical learning environments at schools. So there are three parts to it: condition, the physical state of the asset; fitness for purpose, so how well it actually supports teaching and learning, what it's there for; and then operational efficiency, which is the resources needed to operate that asset. So right now, that is primarily about electricity efficiency, which I'll get into why, but that's kind of where that sits within how we think about things within infrastructure at the ministry. So we, since 2018, have been running a process to collect electricity data from schools. The challenge we face is, one, we're not actually the customer. So we need permission to go get it, and we can't just go get the bills. The system we have means that there are 2,100 schools and we have to go ask for all their information. The other challenge is, once you've got it, keeping this information up to date. So we have been running a process with the help of a third party since 2018 to collect this information, and we use the Electricity Industry Participation Code, which has a bit deep in it that allows third parties to request information if they have the authorization of the customer. So I want to acknowledge the fact that we wouldn't be able to access this information without the support of Cortexo, who we contract to help us in that process and to navigate all the regulations that the Electricity Authority have. So to do that, we need to get, ICPs and account numbers and the retailers from the schools. But that's easier said than done sometimes, and we've been doing a big push. But right now the focus is on electricity, because it is at almost every school is connected to the grid, but also there is a process we can use, and I'll get into later about how we're trying to expand that. So the energy efficiency trials kind of happened in parallel, but also supported by this work we were doing. So in budget 2018, I think it was, no, 2019, we got funding to run the electricity efficiency trials alongside some other environmental sustainability work. So, we got the money, and then it was, okay, how are we going to select schools and what do we want? So the key thing we wanted out of the trials was investigate a group of schools that were a good subset of portfolio, and what could we learn from what was happening at them and what the situation, the context there, that we could apply across our portfolio of 2,100 schools. So we took, at that stage, we had access to about 800 schools' electricity information. So we took that as a very long list and kind of narrowed that down, because we wanted a good mix of schools, school type, so secondary, primary, everything in between, location across the country, the size of the school. And so we whittled that list down, and then we approached schools, and it was a little bit first come, first served, and we ended up with 56 schools. And then we went out to market, and it wasn't me, I think Craig was actually involved at this point, and got responses from the market to help us with the trials. And we ended up with 2 suppliers out of the many that came, and we went with 2 because we wanted to get 2 different opinions. We wanted different opinions, so not just having 1 supplier, but also 2 was nice and manageable, and a good split across our 56 schools. So this is where DETA came in, and as Craig already said, they looked after the schools in the South Island and the Lower North Island. I think it was 33, but Jeff can tell you. And now I'm going to pass on to Jeff, and he can talk about what they did, how they did it, what they learned, the fun of working with the ministry, all the above. And then I'll come back and do a little bit more.
Sweet, flawless. Thanks, Elliot. Before I start introducing myself, I'll just make sure that this works and I can share this. And we are flawless. I trust you can see the full presentation.
Yeah, I can see that.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Kia ora koutou. My name is Jeff Smith. I'm one of the directors at DETA Consulting. As a 2-second introduction on who we are and what we do, we exist solely to remove 2 million tonnes of emissions from the New Zealand economy. 2 million tonnes for us is 25% of New Zealand's industrial emissions. We want to tag that to something that's really tangible, and that's what drives our strategy right now. Our team is 45 as of today, engineers, project managers who are doing 3 key things: decarb strategy, project development, and project implementation. And so the work I'll talk about today really flows into that sort of decarb strategy, and I guess that from an energy efficiency perspective. And this slide was not supposed to be here. I've just copied it across, but simplistically, a lot of the work we do is in the industrial sector. More than happy to talk more broadly about energy and some of the work we're doing at sort of a higher level from a strategy, with a strategy lens. But today we are talking really about our work here with the Ministry of Education. And so what do we do? Well, we were appointed by Craig and Elliot and the team to come and work across 33 schools, well done Elliot, to run essentially energy audits across those schools. And an energy audit follows a really structured process. It's a standard as indicated in this AS NZS 3598. I'm sure many of you will know that standard, and if you don't and you can't sleep tonight, then feel free to go and read that standard. Yeah, like I said, it's a really structured process to outline what you must do. And I guess the other piece that we did is a lot of metering, and I'm going to have some graphs to show you afterwards. But obviously the audit is a process to take information, take data, take some knowledge of a site once you've been to a site, and then utilize that data in an appropriate way to make some recommendations, which we'll outline later on. But the data is a really key part of why I think this program was quite successful. So in terms of, I guess, stepping through the activities that we went through, so we had 33 schools, we had 6 engineers and 3 teams running these audits, and as Elliot said, they were across the country. And as you can see from some of the photos, some of them are large, some of them are small, and that presented its own set of challenges and opportunities, I might say. But when we're going to these sites, we're looking at sort of 3 key things. We want to start to have a bit of a look at scheduling, how they're used, how the schools are used, how the buildings are used, when they're used, and what other assets they have that are used at certain times and in certain ways. We did a bit of an assessment on metering to understand where we can stick our plug and play meters. We used a program, we partnered with Genesis Energy for this, and they have a little program called Centrica. Centrica have little clip-on meters, and so we could meter some quite discrete loads, which was really useful, especially if the school had a pool or had a boiler plant. We could understand the electricity portion of those quite easily. And I guess, yeah, the other piece we were looking to do here is to try and ascertain what some of the opportunities would be for energy reduction, and then ascertain some of the capital side, as well as some of the saving sides of those opportunities to present, I guess, what I'd call a high-level business case for investment. All of our audits are presented in a pretty similar way, but this is what an EMO list looks like. And so for some of these schools, as you can, if you could read, they're quite small, but we've got some opportunities with some really short paybacks, pretty much behavior change stuff. So changing set points and changing the use or how you use some of these assets. So those first 2 are around room temperature and spaces, and then set point of the pool. So you don't have to physically change anything. It's not going to cost anything for you to do, but you have to change the way that you use that asset. There's some which have a short payback, and so that's in this case around insulating some of those hot water cylinders. And there's other opportunities with quite a long payback, and we'll talk about that later on. But some of those long payback opportunities are linked more to the envelope of the school, the construction itself. If you look at the bottom there, lots of these schools are single glazed currently. And so if we were to double glaze those schools, because the schools are used quite sporadically and the cost to retrofit is quite expensive, the payback in terms of years is quite a long time. Although from a straight energy perspective, it's quite difficult to justify some of these projects, as Elliot mentioned, there are other reasons why the ministry might like to go and pursue double glazing, be that a more comfortable learning space, acoustics, less radiative cooling, or radiative feeling, I should say, from some of those windows. So yeah, but we're looking at this completely from an energy and payback perspective, which is why some of these paybacks look a little bit miserable. But again, trying to say to schools, you've had us on site, thanks for having us, do this stuff, and you'll see an immediate difference on your power bill, was one of the things we really wanted to give to the excuse me, schools for being part of the process. Because we were going to so many schools, as Elliot said, there's some that are old, some that are new. There was a lot of discrepancy around how equipment is labelled, how metering was applied, could be applied. And so it was really difficult for us to sort of turn up on site in some locations, as you'll sort of see that this grey board up here. Pretty difficult for us to understand where some of those loads came from, and getting sub-metering was quite complicated. But some of them, like this one here, are really well annotated, and we could understand that quite clearly. So again, if it adds to the complexity, adds to the time, adds to the cost if information is available. Having information that's available makes it far easier to have to collect the best information and then to make the most sensible recommendations. Yeah, but again, because the portfolio is so wide, clearly you live with what you've got. And so some of the findings we found, so let's just sort of jump forward into what we found. So I guess we found initially that there's a lot of after-hours load. So lots of schools use power when they possibly shouldn't be using power. Most of that's weekend load or evening load. And we could see that from some of the metering, and I'll show you some graphs shortly. But as you can sort of see, there's a list of schools. Oh, I was supposed to hide those. Anyway, the list of schools indicating when those loads occurred, if they were night loads or day loads, and what that portion was between night and day. And some of them were quite good. In fact, they didn't use very much energy during the night versus the day. And some of them were not so good, where they used energy a lot during the day and also a lot during the night. So again, that's a behaviour change piece. Schools are really only in use between 8 and 3, aside from perhaps some evening classes in some cases. But lots of the day that those energy pieces didn't have to be on. And most of those energy users were servers for data. And some of those servers might be in a central location serving multiple schools. But that point was, again, a potential for extra or additional load. But pools, lots of schools have pools. Our school doesn't have a pool down here, ELLIOT, so we'll talk about budgeting for that later on. But again, the way those pools are used and those pools are potentially paid for is a little disparate. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of work that can be done around reducing demand by using pools more sensibly. What does that look like? So in this case, for this school, here's your Saturday, Sunday, Monday. We've got sort of a usage and demand for this particular sub. And then over the weekend, it sort of just goes all the time. It actually drops away more during the weekdays than it does the weekend. So again, without that metering information, we wouldn't have any clarity on what was actually happening there. So again, this is a set point change to essentially reduce or eliminate this piece of load, which is the vast majority of when that load is actually used. Same with the pool load. So this particular pool was only available during the weekdays, not the weekend. But again, there's a lot of load during the weekend that was, again, quite substantial. So again, having that metered information allows us to illustrate what that looks like and really get a handle on what those numbers in terms of savings are going to look like too. I'll jump on from that. So we did all these schools, and then once we'd done those, we wanted to have a bit of a benchmark and figure out, look, who's doing things well and who's not doing things well. And so we started to assess things on a kilowatt hour per square metre basis. We felt that was the most fair, given the usage of those schools. And so we were looking at, I guess, electrical usage. Where possible, we looked at some thermal usage, but we'll talk about that in a moment. There's obviously a lot of different types of thermal usage that some schools were consuming. And then tried to sort of tie that into an overall efficiency piece for kilowatt hours per square metre. And so what we found, I mean, this is quite a large number, some of those bigger schools were the ones that were performing the worst. And the reason they were performing the worst really is because they had large thermal loads and large inefficient thermal loads. So the heating systems for these schools was driving a lot of these inefficiencies. Some of the smaller ones down here, again, smaller schools, better control, believe it or not. If you've got 1 or 2 classrooms in a school, they have better control because it's right in your face rather than being something which is kind of, you know, the caretaker takes care of that, or just appears as part of a larger asset. I guess the other thing is some of these schools at the bottom, the heating system might be a fireplace in the corner of the room, which we found in a number of schools, especially on the west coast of the South Island. So it's not like you have heat pumps or the central system. You literally have one classroom with a fireplace and the wood comes from Old Maid over the road. So some of those energy pieces and cost pieces are a little different for some of the portfolio that the ministry actually looks after, which again, we didn't appreciate till we had attended and had been to these schools and had a look around ourselves. So what we're sort of seeing, I guess, if we look at an average and an international average, there is no national average from a school perspective. ELLIOT said they didn't really have that information. We created this ourselves, but some of the worst schools are 160 kilowatt hours a square. Some of the better ones are 25, and average are about 61. That's reasonably close. It matches quite well with some of the numbers we got out of the US DOE, which gave an indication of some numbers there, as you can see. So the average piece was actually quite a good representation, but as you can see, some of the outliers lie a long way out. I've talked about some of these. So again, the fireplace, here's the fireplace in the corner of the room. We're looking at it on a straight energy perspective. We haven't brought cost into this just yet. And so again, with firewood, it doesn't really matter if it's free firewood from your neighbour or from your own land. It doesn't really matter what you're paying for it. Or sorry, it doesn't matter how much energy you use if you're not paying for it. It's kind of irrelevant. So some of those cost-saving pieces don't really work. There have to be other reasons to do these improvements. And going back to what Elliot talked about earlier on, having you use better language than I'm going to use Elliot, but efficient schools or high-quality schools, it's better thing. Yeah, whatever you mentioned. It's a little harder for a school to do it themselves, especially if there's no economic return. They can just chuck a bit more wood in the fire. Variation facilities, so some have pools, some have halls, some have lots of different things. So again, that's really hard to get some consistency across schools and consistency for the MOE to push out some of these measures if schools are quite different. And then the inefficient heating system. So I mean, we've seen a number, but that's one such example of this crappy old boiler, which I'm sure is being changed out now as part of the MOE's coal boiler replacement program. But lots of those centralised boilers are really awful. They require significant maintenance, and again, if you're burning coal, or some were burning coal, the ministry is currently going through and changing out those boilers as part of, I guess, the carbon neutral government program requirements, which is good. And hopefully most are going to heat pumps, hopefully. A few opportunities, optimization of heating. We've talked about replacing things, but really easy to change set points. We see this commonly across your schools as one area, but office buildings is the same. I'm sure at Otago, you've done a lot of work in this space. But again, savings are quite site-specific. Works well at some sites and not so well at others. And like I said, if fuel is free, then who cares? Heat pumps. We think heat pumps are a great solution in schools. The main reason is you don't need high temperatures for heating, and they are cost-effective, way more efficient and effective and safe than those two units that were sort of indicated there, which were both photos from our audits of those 33 schools. Again, savings are site-specific, depends on temperature, size of the room, all those sort of things. LED lights. So again, a lot of opportunity to replace and upgrade fittings in lots of spaces. Significant opportunity for energy reduction across the portfolio. Yep. We talked about pool pumps a little bit. A lot of work to be done on pools in our view. The key reason for that is pools, and I keep going back to them, the pumps themselves use a lot of energy. They're quite an energy dense thing, and they are operating quite a lot of time for quite a lot of time, and they don't necessarily need to be. So just having them circulating all the time probably isn't the best use for that pool pump. There's probably some simple things that can be done around assessing water quality more regularly, changing filtration cycles, just getting that pump to run less than what it already does, or ramping down on a variable speed drive. So hypothetically, if we did all those things across I guess all of those schools, and we had a look at other opportunities, then we think that lots of those schools can step forward quite considerably. There's clearly a few schools like their top one, or the top two, I should say, who won't move forward. But the key reason for that is that they have a really crappy old coal boiler system and required significant investment to have that changed. I think that's occurring right now. The other piece is, if the economic case isn't there in terms of free firewood, why would we recommend to change some of that stuff out unless there's another reason? Because energy cost isn't really a driver then. But largely, it's because of the old and inefficient systems installed. But as you can sort of see there, we think we can step forward. Most of those schools quite a long way. If you recall, that number was about 62 last time. If we make these small improvements, which feel quite small, but LED replacements, maybe some heat pumps in some places and get set points right, we're talking about sort of 30% of that energy usage reducing. That would be that benchmark down to 41 kilowatt hours per square metre per year across the portfolio, which feels a lot better than 62. How do they get there? Oh, sorry, how do they get to an efficiency score of 10? So let's say we're going forward 20 years and the ministry's had a utopian budget to do everything they possibly could want to do. I'm the chair of a school in Christchurch. It's a rebuild. We were built 2 years ago. And I'd say that school is a really good example of one that could be an efficiency score of 10. It's full of heat pumps. It's got really high performing fabric. It's got sensible use of facilities. It's got a really, I guess, dense school, for want of a better word. It doesn't have lots of disparate classrooms. It's all quite tight. Forget the server thing. The other thing that they have on that school is PV. And I think schools have a real opportunity to have solar installed, not just for generation at school, but also as a community asset. Certainly opportunities from a resiliency perspective for the community as well. And having gone through the Christchurch earthquakes, having somewhere to charge a phone would have been quite a useful thing to do. So those small things, I think there are certainly ways and roles for schools to play in the broader community sense as we adapt to climate change. I'm going to kick on from this. I'm going to jump over here. Right, cool. Our recommendations. So there's lots of recommendations here that we made to the ministry. First thing is data capture, which is underway, and Elliot's going to talk about that shortly, about the information that they're capturing from schools. Second thing is, apart from carbon footprinting, which I'm sure Elliot will touch on as well, it was suggesting that we maybe pick a few areas like pools, scheduling optimization, benchmarking, and actually focus on those areas and educate schools in the way to use their schools appropriately from an efficiency perspective. The third thing that I thought was more interesting is using the information we have to engage better with students and use some of the learnings to help them understand, yes, graphs and engineering, but more linking true sustainability for me with kind of with the school curriculum. A lot of what our school talks about is waste and rubbish and recycling. I think from a carbon perspective, this sort of stuff is as important. It's not as tangible and not as easy for the general populace to understand. But I think if we adopted ways to include that within the curriculum, then there are certainly ways that we could do that. So again, if we have an energy use piece here for the school that you happen to be in, you could ask some questions around interpreting the graph. What does that look like? What does the annual piece look like? And ask some critical questions around what do you think is causing this to happen? And I personally like that piece around helping, yes, take the NOE forward, but helping the next generation be far more literate with carbon more generally and efficiency. I've been really fast through that, so I rushed lots of those slides. More than happy to hand back to you, Elliot, to wrap things up.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. I'd just like to also point out that your school, Allen Road, also has you as a board chair, so don't forget that as an input into why its sustainability is so good.
Sure. We can talk about that.
We can talk about that. So I have one more slide, but I don't need to put it up. I'll just talk to kind of what we did next and then touch on some of the stuff Jeff talked about how we've shifted in carbon, the carbon space as well with Carbon Neutral Government Program, which I've been leading our response on behalf of the state schooling sector for about the past 10 months. So there's a lot of great information that came through these reports, and the tough thing is, as Jeff kind of talked about, kind of what do you do with it? So at a portfolio level, it was how can we take some of the lessons from this and get it into our property planning processes, where 20% of the schools go through a planning cycle each year. And so across 5 years, we touch on all our schools. So one of the things we actually did while this was going on is, with the electricity information we'd been collecting through our other process, created a kind of electricity benchmarking report as a bit of a rough, how could we use this information? And so it was a little bit of a look at how efficient, or what's your electricity usage like in total per square meter per student compared to schools in your area and schools in your area of the same type, because you might have similar characteristics. And I think one of the things that came out of the energy efficiency trial is we now have a better idea of what planners could do with that information, but also what else we could do with the data we have, especially as the market moves towards more 30-minute data breakdown for schools. And as Jeff said, you can kind of get into that looking at schools across a day, but doing that for the whole portfolio instead of in these 56 schools, we had really detailed information and metering information, but to be frank, it's very expensive to get, and so that, you know, we don't have I think the phrase Jeff used was utopian budget to do all of this. So like, what's the balance between getting the best value for money, but also like pushing and getting and supporting schools in this way? So as Jeff said, the carbon neutral government program got created at the end of 2020, and that's aiming to get the government carbon neutral by 2025. As part of that, we, the ministry, are reporting on behalf of the state schooling sector. Doing that is complicated because there are 2,100 distinct organisations that we need the support of. So we have we got DETA to take the energy efficiency trial schools, all of them, and go do carbon baselining for the 2019 year. So that was a pre-COVID level, to both let us know what were the key drivers of carbon emissions across those schools, but also the challenge of trying to collect that information at a school level. So we've done that work. We reported to ministers, and for the reporting year that has just started 12 days ago, we're reporting on electricity emissions, coal emissions, natural gas emissions, and then emissions from ministry contracted school transport. So electricity is fine. There's a process to gather that information that we can use. We need to get the right information from all schools and the right permissions so we can do it. And we went out with, as Jeff showed me when he got sent the email, a state school kind of energy stock take to collect that kind of base information from schools to do that. I think so far we've probably got about, I want to say 70%, but don't quote me on that, of schools back with that information, which is really impressive given the time frame we've had. There isn't a process to collect this information for gas. And so we're trying to set that up given the crossovers and with the support of industry to kind of collect that information. And that's a piece of work we're doing. But even with all this reporting, we are doing significant work to reduce carbon emissions in the portfolio. Jeff talked about the coal boiler replacement program. We also have a program to do improvements at small and isolated schools across the country. And one of the things that is happening in that is LED lighting. So that's a program for over 600 schools in the country. So that has the bonus of energy efficiency, cost reduction for the school, but also a little bit of carbon reduction, although carbon reduction in the electricity space isn't as big ticket as coal is. So that's, you know, we're moving forward from here, but it's, you know, change doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's the key thing to point out. We've got a lot out of this, and we've got to think about the best way to use it and support schools, but also how can we drive it from the centre as well. So yeah, that's really what I want to say on that. Happy to take questions. I also do note there are some in the chat, one of which Jeff has already answered. So thanks, Craig.
Well, thanks very much, Elliot and Jeff. And I think maybe we will start with that first question in the chat from Michael, kind of leading on from what you were just talking about there, Elliot, around what data might the ministry hold now that could be made available to researchers? Because I think, having sat on your side of the fence, you're very busy often trying to implement some of these programs, and get things running, and sometimes the time to sit and look into the data and maybe find new insights isn't always there. So if there was an opportunity to partner with researchers, I think that would be good. But what's the access like for researchers?
One would almost think you used to manage the research and development team at the ministry, Craig. So we do have a lot of information on particularly electricity use and the kind of where it exists 30-minute breakdown. We're also getting a better insight into what are the other energy sources, not necessarily the amount of consumption at schools, because our stock take kind of asks schools, do you use electricity, do you use gas, do you use diesel, coal, just to get a bit of a insight into that. The key challenge is it's not our information, and have we asked, have schools expected us to use it for this purpose? And I suppose internal research is one thing, but where it gets into the challenge and where I would understand you'd want to go with this and academic research is the publishing aspect of it. So it gets into the little bit of that kind of stuff where we have to worry about identifying schools. So it's not insurmountable, but especially if you wanted to look at a group of schools, you'd probably need permission from those schools. So for example, we have solar providers who want to access this information so that they can support schools who want to go into the solar space. It's not something we direct schools into at this moment in time. Those companies have to show us that they have the permission of the school where I can give that data, because it's not my data to give. The school's allowed me to give it. So I think it could happen, but there are some things to work through. Not insurmountable, but yeah, challenges that Craig's familiar with. All right. Also, Craig's frozen, so he's not even here. Oh yeah, Jeff, did you measure? Okay, you measured internal temperatures too when you're out there. Yeah. That is also a part of our work program that I talked about before. So the fitness for purpose of learning environments has internal environmental monitoring devices, and that is one of the aspects that they measure. And so that's one of the things that's, now that we have that, how can you compare these two data sets? And so that's one of the challenges we have, as we're in the final stage of developing and implementing that program. Michael, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so I have lots of questions actually. I really enjoyed that presentation. It was good. I guess where I'm coming from with the data access is often I'm looking for student projects, and having data available at the sort of scale you're talking about would be fantastic for some of those projects. But okay, so I've got kind of maybe questions for both of you, but one maybe for Jeff is sort of around the heat pump versus hydronic heating, say biomass generated heating, and sort of, I guess, a sort of more holistic approach to the schools. Because I guess when you start talking about heat pumps, at least at the university, they've talked a lot about moving away from heat pumps because it tends to increase their peak load, and the usefulness of sort of hydronic heating and having buffer tanks and things like that allows them to do, I guess, just think a bit more holistically about their energy use. And I just wondered what your opinions were on that.
Sure, I have lots of opinions on that, and I'm more than happy to jump in. So the first thing I'll say is, you talk about a holistic piece from a university perspective. I'm talking about a holistic piece from a national perspective. We've just written a paper, sorry, let me go back a step. We're just finishing an engagement with ECA, Transpat, and every EDB in the country, looking at every industrial process heat user, which includes every school with a boiler more than 0.5 megawatt, and try to understand what they're going to go and convert to. A bottom-up model, essentially. There are 370 fossil fuel boilers in the South Island, 800 in the North Island. So it is a reasonably chunky piece of New Zealand's emissions footprint, and it's 10% of our national footprint, 7.8 million tonnes of emissions from that sector. What we found is that there are regions in New Zealand that do not have enough biomass. Now, you are in one in Otago where you do have sufficient biomass right now, but I would say that there is more need, especially for where you are geographically, to have that biomass out of the town and be used for those industrial sites that are going to be paying millions of dollars for electrical upgrades because they can't get access to biomass, rather than you, who does have capacity nearby. And yes, it costs money to upgrade the infrastructure, but from an NZ Inc. perspective, it is significantly cheaper for you to make that upgrade rather than some dairy factory in the middle of nowhere. So I'd apply that lens. What I'll do is, for those of you who are interested, I'll just stick a link into the chat, which goes to that green paper and has all those numbers that I quoted them listed inside. But I think that's probably the bigger picture piece here, is getting that lens. And again, you as an education institute, you do have government money, you do have an ability to think beyond just your boundary, and the impact that you would have on the region, I think, is worth considering.
Okay, interesting. So I have one more question, if I'm allowed. So I was just wondering what, you know, if in an ideal world, what, I mean, I guess I think a lot about the sort of buildings that we're building now, the new buildings, and I guess making sure they're future-proof. And what's a future-proof? What does a future-proof school look like? Like if we were going to build a new school now, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is how do we retrofit these schools to make them more efficient, and etc. Is a new future school, you know, built to passive house standard or something like that? And is there any effort to try and head down that route for the next school we build, or the, yeah. So that's probably a question for you, Elliot, maybe.
Just asking a nice, easy question there. So, okay, a couple of things on there. So I can answer partly in that space, although it's a better question for my colleagues in the school design team, but I know them well enough to know parts of this. So we do have build standards for new buildings. Part of that will be driven by what's coming in the Building for Climate Change program out of the CNGP, which has some of that stuff in it, but we also have our own designing quality learning spaces standards, which right now most of them are in the area of acoustics, lighting, temperature, thermal, indoor air quality. But you know, we're having to move into the space. You mentioned passive housing. I know that the difficulty with thinking about passive housing, and Craig probably can jump in potentially on this as well, is the usage profile of schools is the opposite for the key thing of passive housing. We don't need to heat space overnight because no one's there. And so passive housing is much more suited to residential. And so having to think about that in a school way is our challenge. And that's a challenge we find with a lot of our stuff. We have a full spectrum of schools, from, you know, one building, you know, with 2 rooms through to massive high schools. And, you know, there's no one thing that we can apply to all of them. There are some learnings we take for residential stuff. There's some learning we take from commercial buildings, but a lot of our usage is during the day and not at night. And the other challenge is, yeah, we talk about retrofit, but that's also because there are already, as I said, 16,000 buildings, 2,100 schools in the portfolio. So if we focus just on the new schools, we may at most build 4 of those a year. And that's, we need to deal with the big chunk. That's the existing stock is where the opportunity is and where the change needs to happen. Not that we don't need to do that bit in the new schools, but I think sometimes if we focus on that, we lose sight of this whole big bit. So it's a both. And I think I did a great job of semi-answering your question in the part that I could and wanted to answer. So feel free to come back at me.
Thanks a lot.
And I'll just add there. So Jeff alluded to the Christchurch Schools rebuild, which was a really good test of the Ministry of Education standards over that 10-year period of that program, as it and what it produces in terms of the energy efficiency levels of those 115 schools that have been through various levels of upgrades to complete rebuilds and completely new schools. What you see when you look at that, and there was a student, an engineering student from Massey who did a study on this 4 years ago now, it was all over the shop. So the standards were too loose, and you can get really, and it all, I think their findings came down to, it was to do with the people involved in the project. So the delivery manager from the ministry and the design consultants that they had on board, and how hard they would battle to be able to keep the more energy efficient solutions in, and some of those external forces with to a degree fixed budgets. And so I think this is a theme that plays out across all of these spheres, and the same thing happens at the university as well. What becomes your not negotiable in terms of your lighting solution and your heating solutions and those kinds of things. I think the Ministry of Education is not alone in sort of needing to tighten up various elements of that design process.
I know we haven't addressed Rob's question in the chat. So typically what percentage of operational expenditure was energy? Jeff, I don't know if you had anything on this, but my response is, yeah, okay, let's shake the head from Jeff. It varies, and we kind of don't know. I say it varies. Schools receive peat, light and water funding, but it's part of their operations grant. And so their operations grant has a bunch of components in it, and that will be it will not increase kind of necessarily easily logically, depending on the change in the context and the number of students. And so we can't quite quantify that. We do know, and we hear that the costs are increasing on the sector, and that's something we're aware of, which is why this efficiency stuff's really good. It's how can we use the same things but use it better, and as Jeff points out, a lot of it is around behaviour stuff. So kind of communicating that out to the sector. But yeah, don't there's no one answer to that question at the moment. And part of that is I can collect electricity consumption information, but there's no process for me to collect information on the tariff rate breakdown that schools are paying on electricity or on other energy sources. So we just don't have a clear enough view of that.
Sean, I think you had a question.
I was just gonna, I think it's sort of related to that, a bigger picture question around the framing of the project as an energy efficient. When I look at the material that Jeff presented, a lot of the really exciting things were more around behavioral change and thinking about energy differently. So I just get a comment around the rationale of framing it as sort of energy efficiency as the focus and the goal.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things, and we put that back to the ministry, was what do we really want to do here? Because, I mean, yes, there's energy efficiency stuff. We're driving towards fuel switch because we want to get those massive carbon savings. But if I put on my big picture lens on again, we think from an efficiency perspective, we can get 30% of the load away by essentially behaviour change and some really low, easy, simple things to do. What that does is it frees up capacity electrically, it frees up capacity from a biomass perspective for others to use. And across 2,000 schools, that's a large load. So I agree. I think efficiency leads this piece, but clearly there are other aspects that the ministry is involved with. And I think the hardest thing, and Elliot, you can talk to it better than me, but it appears the hardest thing is actually coordination when there's so many things going on. Actually getting a coordinated response as it seems to be challenging. Is that fair?
Yep, that's probably fair, and it's also because this isn't the only thing we're doing, even in the infrastructure space, right? So we have a lot of push, and not a lot of I'm not going to say limited resource, but there is a lot of things that we're trying to do to improve the state schooling portfolio and support schools in that way. But yeah. In terms of why we framed it as we framed it, potentially a better question for Craig because he was in and around at that time. I warned him I was going to do this.
I'm happy to take that one.
You can hit that one and I'll tell you if you're wrong.
Yeah, might be a little bit of a view of how the sausage is made. So Elliot mentioned that there was a bunch of energy and sustainability related initiatives that were funded through Budget 2019. That came about through conversations with the new government that came in. There was a National was out, Labour Greens coalition came in, and a lot of the conversations to begin with were around solar on school roofs. And through that, it sort of came like, if you just do the fuel switch without first looking at efficiency, you might overbuild. And so there needed to be an energy efficiency component to the package. And so that's how, and then things get labeled, right? They get labeled, this is the school's energy efficiency trial. And then it comes to somebody like me or Elliot. And then you've got to go and deliver that trial. And I think it was one of the pleasing things to see, from Jeff, was the ability to kind of think more broadly and say, well, how do we move this into a more nuanced space where behavior changes should be the most exciting thing that a principal sees. Here's $15,000 I can save over the next year by making a change tomorrow. So yeah, that's kind of how the labeling started and how it's pleasing to see that is moving. But I think often it relies on good people being the critic and conscience of society and sort of challenging when the bureaucracy gets a little bit blinkered and deliberate. We've done, and to be honest, the Ministry of Education delivered energy efficiency trials about 8 years before this one, and nothing really
on a
came
lot
of it.
smaller scale.
Yeah.
And we were much less developed in terms of how we worked at that time.
Because it didn't really have anywhere to put the findings, whereas, you know, the diagram Elliot shared was Te Harato and the condition and the fitness for purpose and the operational efficiency, and saying, okay, so if we understand what it's costing to heat this school, and we can understand that that's keeping it at a comfortable temperature, then we can go tick tick. But if there's something out of balance, then we might have a way to respond to that actually solves a problem rather than just moving where that problem sits. Because my internet's unstable here in Christchurch, no, it must be Jeff's fault. I've lost what's in the chat. So is there any other questions in the chat?
There's nothing else in the chat.
Okay.
Can I just touch on one thing for a moment? It goes back to Sean's question around how big energy really is. And I think that goes to the engagement piece, where, look, energy isn't that big a number in the grand scheme of things. And the school that I'm a part of, when I see the report, the finance reports, energy isn't the biggest number by a long stretch. And so I don't think it gets the focus that it possibly needs. And so when you're looking for schools to react and respond, and again, 30% of a medium-sized number is, you know, it's still good. But I think going back to the education piece, there's an education piece for students, which is cool and nice to talk about. But there's also an education piece for staff to go and say, look, yes, it's not as big a number, but in terms of the impact you can have on your bottom line, this is probably the #1 area for you to make some savings. And I don't think that piece is connected at every school. They don't understand that. But that's, I think, part of Elliot's next challenge is how to engage the wider school community to say, yes, we want to be part of this. Here's some easy things to do. And that's those education programs more broadly. Jenny's just jumping there around curriculum support. I completely agree that not the issue, but I guess the opportunity for schools to engage in sustainability is obviously that's being done. But I think it depends on the type of sustainability. Our school is next to an estuary, so we have an ihutai component, which is really cool because the kids get involved and go and see and look at stuff out there, which relates to sustainability. They pick rubbish out of that, but it doesn't relate to the critical numbers that we're talking about today. It's not as engaging at this stage. So I think the challenge is for us, how to make that engaging.
Great. Does anyone else want to chip in with a question?
Okay, I'll have one more if no one else is. So I just wondered about the possibility of ring fencing the savings from energy efficiency for use on larger capital projects, and whether there's any consideration of that sort of thing by the ministry. So I guess what I mean is just taking the savings from any energy efficiency savings you make, and then pooling that money, I guess, for the larger capital projects.
Craig's going to understand that I'm going to try and make this answer non-bureaucratic. Part of the challenge is there are two different buckets of money. So the savings from schools' cost is operating cost, and then any of the large capital expenditure is a capital thing. And we can't, it's not simple of saving here goes here, because money comes from across government. And so there has been some, I've had some conversations, but very kind of like a little bit like you've asked the question, being like, well, what about this? And I think part of the challenge is we do a lot of investment to make these savings. And I've heard it from the other way of we're doing a lot of work and a lot of capital investment to make these savings, but we're not getting back the savings that we're creating at a school level, and that's fine. But yeah, part of the challenge is it's the different buckets of money, and they're not connected in that way. Is the larger challenge in that space. And just because we save operating costs doesn't mean that we'd be allowed to transfer it to capital, because it might go to somewhere else in government, because they might want to invest that money in the context of you guys, universities, let's say that, part of the crowd. So yeah.
I think I'm not sure what's happening these days with the funding model, and I know there's been a lot of coverage about the replacement of decile funding with the equity index, which can only be a good thing. But when I was at the ministry, the problem was always that the schools get funded through their operations grant to do a whole lot of things, including pay your power bill. If they saved any money by changing who the provider was or using less power, they kept that money. There's no way for the Ministry of Education to claw that back. So not only is it operating in capital, but it's Ministry of Education capital funding and schools operating funding. And a lot of people, and ELLIOT doesn't have to concede this, but I'll say it, schools don't get enough operating funding. So anything that can be done to make the operating funding go further and be able to buy more resources for the classroom is a good thing. And that's sort of the view, the prevailing view when I was at the ministry, was that we should be spending our existing capital funding in a way that maximizes that impact for learning, and saving money within the operating sphere can be one way of doing it, but it is tricky. But as they say, been out of that game for 18 months, and hopefully some better conversations are happening. Awesome. On that note, I'd just like to thank ELLIOT and Jeff for a really engaging talk today, and everyone for tuning up and for those questions. It was really, really good. And if you think of anybody who you haven't seen on this call who might benefit from listening, flick them the YouTube link, and then they can watch it in their own time. But thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
Thanks for listening.